Part 1. But what if it is just a dream? I saw her again, crossing the street as I was walking to my flat, my muscles aching as I shuffled my feet along the aging sidewalk. I thought about her the entire time I worked another day of my life away in exchange for a meager wage. As I began daydreaming about where she might be heading, my heavy, shuffling feet caught on the edge of the crumbling sidewalk. I tasted my own blood as I bit down hard on my lower lip the instant my body made contact with the concrete. I am unsure if it was my girly scream that attracted her to the scene, or if it was the $2.56 in change that flew out of my shirt pocket, landing in every direction with an array of chiming sounds. There was blood and coins everywhere, not to mention the tears, so I won't. I never said I was the manliest type around, but I did attempt to pretend when I noticed her walking over to me. I tried wiping the blood from my face with the ends of my shirt, as though the blood pouring from my lip was the only factor that made this scene seem so pathetic.
Are you all right?
She asked, out of breath, with a look of authentic concern on her beautiful face. I think I replied with something awkward like, "Who says there is no pleasure in pain?" As I was making a fool of myself, I made eye contact with her mid-sentence, and I had to look away.
What do you mean?
She asked with a wrinkled nose that made her seem much more adorable. What I meant was that although my face and body were in excruciating pain, I did get to meet her, and in that I felt tremendous pleasure. But I was far too embarrassed to admit it. So I answered her question with, I don't know what I mean. I feel very delusional. I think I have a concussion."
Really?
She asked, this time with panic in her voice. I thought a while before speaking. Then I told her shamefully that I probably did not have a concussion, but I guess I was successful in distracting her from remembering how foolish I had been acting. I think she felt pity for me, and that is why she offered to walk me home. I did not argue one bit with her request. I must have seemed downright desperate. She placed her hand on my face, looked into my eyes, and asked if I needed stitches. "Is it that bad?" I asked, trying to hide my excitement at her touch. She ran her finger along my swollen, bloody lip thoughtfully, and decided that it might be all right without. I agreed, but I could not say a word. I just nodded like a mute man, unable to verbally communicate, even if I had wanted to. At that moment, I would have taken any medical advice she would have prescribed to me. We walked to my home in silence. I was speechless, half believing I was in a dream, or that I had died when my head cracked open on the pavement, my brain matter spilling out for curious on-looking teenagers to poke at with fallen tree branches. It was her sweet voice that reminded me that perhaps I was still alive every time she asked me if I was feeling okay. Each time she asked, I looked at her with the type of smile one finds slapped on the faces of every stoned teenager high out of their nervous systems, standing outside of a rave dance party. This did not help my case for appearing well. Once we arrived at my building, I had no choice but to speak. I reassured her that I was indeed okay. I am not sure if it was in my imagination or if we actually stared into each other's eyes while smiling for at least 7 seconds. Whether or not it happened is irrelevant, because the memory, however false, felt amazing. She let out a slight giggle just before saying that she was rather late for something that sounded important. After she left, I sat down on the front steps of my building. I lit a small cigar and began thinking that perhaps I did injure my brain because I had no recollection of where she said she had to go. And like a dimwit, I failed to introduce myself and to ask her for her name. I truly believe that self-pity and human failure are the only soulmates that exist on this marvelous earth. Fully knowing that the past is unchangeable, I decided to go inside to ice my wound and pour myself a triple shot of tequila, without the lime and salt. My chase of choice is cheap red wine. To me, very few things compare to drinking cheap wine through a red plastic straw in a big gulp cup, with a few cubes of ice bobbing on the surface. As I got drunker, the inspirational spirit began to awaken within me. She had been slumbering for what felt like a lifetime in 7 days, and her absent presence in my life had become noticeable. I do not know a single thing, and I haven't a clue as to what the word truth could possibly mean. But at that moment, I felt that writing would set me free, as long as there was plenty of liquor to fuel the alcoholic, inspirational spirit that dwelt within my core. I began writing a poem about the reality I was experiencing. My words contained the frustration I felt at the world that surrounded me. Perhaps it is time for the backslip. Part 2. The silence between our names. A few months ago, our blessed government decided that the powerful, wealthy, asshole business owners in our city were not making enough money. So they concluded that the work week needed to be extended from 40 mandatory hours a week to a ridiculous 55 hours a week. That way, the businesses could expand their operations while avoiding any overtime costs they might have had to pay out. And of course, our government is always looking out for our best interests. They are, after all, elected by the people, for the people. Our caring government also proposed lowering the minimum wage. This was suggested because they figured that if we worked an extra 15 hours a week, we might start to make too much money. And honestly, who would want that? If they passed this legislation, at the end of a given week, everyone would be working 55 hours and making less money than they made working 40 hours. A great idea, right? Okay, here is the funny part. All sides of the government supported this idea. Even the 2 elected Green Party representatives who treated a vote on the issue to preserve a 3-foot by 2-foot piece of wetland that will be located in the lower right-hand corner of the parking lot of a new shopping mall they plan on erecting. I cannot deny my love for the idea of giving idiot businessmen and stoned hippies the ability to make all our decisions for us. Western democracy, or what is labeled democracy, certainly provides a great deal of amusement for me. I have watched this city change from a flowering artistic haven to this ultra-commercial concept fueled by the anticipated investments of rich foreigners that never seem to arrive. That is probably enough background for you, the blessed reader, to comprehend my state of being and the frequency of my soul. So I write, like a fevered madman in the jungle, feeling what I call it. That is right. I was feeling it. The hours wore away at me, and I began to slow my expression. 3 wine big gulps later, and I was out. Sleep washed over my state. I awoke from a dream at 2:11 a.m. I was mesmerized by the beauty my slumbering mind was capable of creating. I would attempt to describe it, but at this point, while reflecting on the events that occurred, I have completely lost the memory of the illusions that flashed before my sleeping eyes that night. I woke up, mostly sober and unable to return to this utopic slumber. So just like every night, when sleep and I failed to compromise, I went for a walk to my local park to swing upon my favorite swing. I calmly walked the 2 blocks to the park, feeling at ease with the darkness that surrounded me. I love the feeling of being awake while an entire city sleeps all around me, the feeling of being the only person left alive. I often imagine while on these late night walks that a disastrous event has killed every living human except me. I adore that loneliness, or at least I pretend to in my mind when I have these post-apocalyptic visions. It makes me smile that all I want to do after the complete devastation of the human race is swing upon my favorite swing. I feel as though we have been conditioned to experience our lives in anticipation of a colossal event, but doing so means that all the small but beautiful things that fill this world get overlooked as we hunt for this enormous feeling that, like the foreign investors, never seems to arrive. As I enjoyed the darkness, I looked into the distance, and I could see the silhouette of someone swinging away on my favorite swing. I was reluctant to accept the idea that I would have to deal with another post-apocalyptic survivor. The thought in my mind was, just because we are the last two people left on Earth, that does not mean we have to interact with each other. So instead, I sat at a nearby bench and waited for my turn. To me, there is nothing wrong with waiting for something that has importance, even if it only seems important at the given moment. But the more I watched this silhouette enjoying the simple, pendulous motion of the swing, the more I wanted to enjoy the same simple, pendulous motion. I came to the conclusion that I was being rather childish. I mean, the world did just end, and this stranger might be in need of some serious consoling. Plus, I did recall that there were two swings on the set, and although I did not get to use my favorite swing, at least I got to pendulously swing my heart away. How does one approach the only other person left alive after surviving the catastrophe that devastated our immediate reality? Perhaps a simple hello would be adequate, but perhaps not. I decided that I would remain silent until the stranger chose to start a conversation. I quickly changed my mind once I was close enough to see that it was her swinging on my favorite swing. The memory of the experience we shared earlier that day felt like a fading dream, but the cut on my lip proved that I had existed with her in that instant. As soon as she saw me, she stopped pumping her legs and smiled. The arc created by her simple, pendulous motion got smaller and smaller as she lost momentum. I smiled back at her as my chest radiated pure energy into the world.
Your lip looks a lot better.
She said as she carefully examined my face. I smiled again. Do you mind if I join you? I asked rhetorically, because I knew I would swing next to her regardless of how she responded. I walked behind her and gave her a strong push. Then I made my way over to the other swing. She began to pump her legs while I adjusted my weight on my black swing. I recall breathing deeply, soaking in everything I was experiencing to create a vivid memory I could re-examine as I pleased. I forced myself to speak. Do you live in the area? I asked her, feeling boring and uncreative, thinking that of course she lived in the area. Why else would she be at this park at 2 in the morning?
No, I actually live on the other side of town. I drove down here hoping to see you.
She said in all seriousness. I will admit it, I totally bought it. Really? I said with the excitement of a puppy greeting their family as they walked through the front door. She kind of half laughed and said,
Yeah, I live in the area.
I felt a little stupid, but it felt very good knowing that she had a sense of humor. Again, silence conquered our experience, but it was far from uncomfortable. We did not seem to care because their swings were doing all the talking. They squeaked and creaked with every pump of our legs. I felt as though my black swing was projecting me so high I could feel the heat radiating from the stars on my skin. I began to feel a shockwave of nervousness coursing through my frail body due to the undammed river of emotion that was gaining strength as I swung beside this lovely girl. "What is your name?" I said as my sweaty hands slid slightly lower on the chains. I readjusted my grip and listened.
Cassandra.
I have never heard that name be pronounced in such a sensual way. I nearly fell off my swing, barely able to utter, "I am Jared Armando Safoifa."
Jared Armando Safoifa,
she repeated with perfect pronunciation. Now that I am reflecting on that night, all I can think is, she had me at Jared Armando Safoifa. I have one of the craziest names ever bestowed upon an unfortunate man, so I use it as often as is humanly possible.
So, Jared Armando Safoifa. Now what?
She said as she opened the curtains that concealed the windows to my soul so she could get a better look inside. Part 3. A life floating in a bottle. I am not often the impulsive type, but that night I was a forest fire of energy. I leapt from my swing and did a half turn in midair so I could face her after this unimpressive feat. Now, I would like to tell you, the wondrous reader, that I am extremely clumsy, but somehow I landed smoothly on my feet without a stumble. I extended my hand. "Perhaps a walk?" I asked. Before I had finished, her feet were already creating the friction necessary to bring her simple, pendulous motion to a halt. I walked up to her and helped her off her swing. What is life, dear friends? I can barely comprehend it when I am alert. So what chance did I have at 2 a.m. holding hands with Cassandra? All I can say is that this world sometimes throws a few feelings your way that will make your painful time on earth appear as though it makes absolute sense. My friends, the beloved readers, please cherish these feelings, because like anything else, they will surely pass into the past, then into the nothingness. I remember being so aware of what was happening. I recall consciously trying to memorize the size and shapes of the leaves that crunched beneath our feet as we walked beside each other. "So, Cassandra, what is your story?" I asked with a shaky nervousness reminiscent of the first time I stepped on a stage to address a crowd. Her response was silence, as she thought hard about what she would reveal to me.
Jared, my life is an odd thing.
She went silent.
Do you really want to know it?
Her words were weighed down by the mass of her melancholy. The smile on my face faded to a neutral expression. "I would love to know you." I paused. "Your story, I mean." She took a deep breath, sighed, licked her lips, and then dove into the depth of her memory, recalling all that had occurred in her brief 23 years of life. As I retell her story for you, the lovely reader, I must admit that there are many details I have omitted. This is because I feel that they were intended solely for my heart to experience. I will, however, pass along a brief and vague version of Cassandra's life story. Cassandra was born in our very town. She enjoyed the first 7 years of her life living with her loving parents. Cassandra's father was an artist and a famous humanitarian. He was in love with the world and all her creation. Cassandra described him as a man with the largest heart she had ever known. Her father was killed a few days after her 7th birthday. The details of her father's life and death are not included in this document. This is because the details of his life are so fantastical and the facts so numerous that they will overshadow this adventure. I will, however, say that the 7 years Cassandra spent in his company were filled with an undescribable beauty, and I will not foolishly attempt to replicate that feeling with my feeble words. After the death of Cassandra's father, her mother was left a broken woman. Without the love of her partner, she could no longer cope with her reality and did not have the strength to raise a curious 7-year-old daughter. So while Cassandra's mother was sent to a mental institution for reconditioning, Cassandra was sent to live with a relative she had never known. Cassandra was forced to leave behind all she had known in the span of 29 days after the death of her father. 2 days later, she arrived in Sangla, India. Cassandra had been taught by her father that one must always look forward, leaving the past an unmovable stone monument to gaze upon periodically with wonder, but never dwelling or attempting to restructure it. So Cassandra was ready to accept a new reality. But there was no way an optimistic 7-year-old girl could have known about the negativity that is attracted into one's own life when any form of cocaine is present. Cassandra did not know to what extent her life had been hurt by this powdered substance until she was 17. The man Cassandra's aunt called her boyfriend, Ronald, was a major importer and distributor of the white gold. There are many painful things Cassandra went on to describe, things that will remain a secret inside my mind until the angels of God or the demons of hell attempt to pry them from my depth upon my death. At the age of 17, Cassandra's aunt and Ronald were arrested and charged for drug trafficking. The court system and the locals decided the fate of these individuals. The prominent members of the community wanted to make an example of these people that they believed had been ravishing their community for over 22 years. The court went as far as attempting to charge Cassandra as an accessory. It was Cassandra's honest and pure hatred of cocaine that exempted her from a lifetime in a damp prison cell in the slums of India. Thanks to Cassandra's help, local police were able to apprehend many of the people that worked for Ronald. The fate of her adopted parents was sealed with grief when the judge handed out a 111-year sentence for each of them. The judge did have some compassion in a rather ironic sense, allowing both the aunt and Ronald parole after 103 years had been served. Ronald was killed several days after entering the prison system. The police believed Ronald had been killed by former employees serving similar sentences, because the employees thought Ronald had given up their names to the authorities. As for the aunt, Cassandra assumes that she is still in a cell somewhere in the heart of India. Cassandra was left alone once again, but this time it did not feel like a loss. After sunset, Cassandra went into the mansion she once inhabited. She had to pry away wooden boards that sealed the windows and doors. Cassandra did this with a large stick that she had sharpened at one end. The police had searched the property, but she suspected that they did not find the large fortune that lay dormant underneath the floor tiles beneath the bathtub. It took her most of the day because the police had stolen nearly all of Ronald's tools from the storage room. With much effort, she did eventually get at the fortune. Cassandra spent the next 3 years traveling the world without a single care. She gradually gravitated towards London. She crossed every border illegally, quickly learning that cash money is the only passport required for global travel. She saw many things on her travels and was changed because of them. Again, I must mention that these stories were meant solely for my ears to absorb. Once in London, she met a businessman whose profession was laundering money. And so for a fee, Cassandra was able to legitimize the remaining fortune, making it possible for the fortune to travel across the pond with her. Her intentions had always been to reconcile with her mother in Canada. Cassandra did manage to track down her mother, but I am not comfortable sharing the details of that experience. After finding her mom, she decided to return to her hometown to start a new life and to pursue her artistic endeavors. She had refined her abilities throughout her adventures, and she told me that creating art was the only way she was able to cope with her mostly man-made reality. Once she finished her story, she could not stop smiling. She even kissed me on the cheek and told me I was sweet. But I was not sweet. I was smitten.
Jared,
She said, wrinkling her nose.
you know it's your turn, right?
I did not hesitate. I wanted to expose my naked soul to her and needed her to examine all the pieces that made up my perception of life. Once more, I must apologize to you, the curious reader, for I need to omit my own life story. It has no place within this work of writing. But if you are interested in my wretched, twisted, and mostly depressing story of a life, I have written 3 thick volumes on this subject, consisting of 999 double-sided pages each. These volumes can be found in 2,997 corked bottles containing 1 double-sided page per bottle. The bottles are floating somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Playa Tilapa in Guatemala. As I told Cassandra about my life, I felt as though I was singing it to her. We even laughed at my misery and the misfortune I have had the fortune of enduring. When I was finished, I felt like all the tragedy I had experienced was so I could share it with Cassandra that evening in the park. I felt healed and a rebirth, similar to that of a tree sprouting leaf buds in the spring after a harsh and bitter winter season. My chest began radiating love for everything around me. I noticed Cassandra breathing deeply and slowly, taking in this power energy. I stopped walking and laid down on the grass, and I began to make a snow angel in the fallen leaves. I guess technically one would have to call it a leaf angel, but you know what I mean. Cassandra joined me, our fingertips barely touching. The slight caress of her hands connecting at the fingers was one of the most sensual things I've ever felt. Part 4. The Stars. Humanity's only witness. I reached out as we laid in the yellow autumn grass, and there I held her hand as we marveled at the diamonds placed in the darkness of the night sky. I never really noticed how magnificent it was that ancient light surrounds us from every angle. Growing up, I hardly gave any attention to the stars. They were so obvious that their elegance had no effect on my being. That night was different, though. It was as if Cassandra's presence had awakened an awareness of the subtle beauty that had and will always surround me. I could not have been more thankful. As I was giving thanks to any god that would hear my prayer, I was interrupted by Cassandra.
I think we're going the wrong way.
To which I replied, Cassandra, we are not going anywhere. We are just laying in the grass, watching the stars slowly pass us by. I think I was trying to be funny, and it kind of worked. Cassandra smiled.
No, Jared. I mean, have you ever seen the night sky without photo pollution?
No, I never have, I answered earnestly. She went on to describe the stars she had seen on her travels, about how she had been thousands of miles away from any man-made light source. She captured my imagination by telling me about a sky so alive with millions of stars that one could hardly believe that they were still on planet Earth and not on a spaceship in the depths of the universe in search of adventure. She told me that she had adapted her sleeping pattern to one that made her nocturnal, so that she could examine the stars until their glow was overwhelmed by our solar system's centralized star, the sun, and how every morning she would watch the sun rise over the local mountains.
Modern technology can do so many wonderful things. But if those wonders came at a loss of our ability to marvel at our placement in the universe, then truly we're moving in the opposite direction of where we should be going. Think about it, Jared. Our ancestors had a much harder life than we did, in a sense. But they also had no choice in noticing the beauty this planet has to offer. I wish everyone could see an undisturbed night sky at least once in their lives. Then they'd never be the same after realizing what's been taken from them.
I paused and took in her words carefully. You are absolutely right. Just look at what people have done to our reality. Take art, for example. Artists are not able to express themselves without having to attach the concern of monetary compensation to their creation.
What do you mean?
She asked, intrigue and curiosity. I mean that people make art to make money. They do not make art to create beauty or to express the deepest part of themselves. Sandra looked up at me, then up at the night sky. She was contemplating whether or not she wanted to continue with the topic of conversation, or if she would completely change the subject. Cassandra chose to reveal more of herself with,
Jared, not all artists care about money, making it, having it, or exchanging it for their art. Some do, and those are the artists that we're familiar with because of their commercial exposure. But for some people, art is a very personal experience. An experience that they may never share with another person, let alone trade it for some colored pieces of paper that some bank or government has deemed valuable.
I chewed on her words like a cow surrounded by greenery. I remember thinking, who is this girl, and why is her presence affecting me so deeply? Spoke again.
I understand why an artist would want to get money for their expression. To them, it's like, do I want to work some job I dislike so I can make my living? Or do I want to work to do what I love all the time to get the money I need?
That is true, I said. I work a job I dislike. I give my boss 40 hours of my life each week, and soon I will be giving my boss 55.
Jared Armando Safoifa, I understand your frustrations with art being sold for money. I believe that if you attach money to your art, there's no way to break away from its influence. Even if the artist is unaware, she might subconsciously pick up that a certain style sells better than another, or that a certain way of creating will gain her more attention, and slowly they move away from being an artist to becoming more of a craftsperson or a laborer. Some even come to despise the creative process because it becomes a chore or a necessity of survival rather than the creative expression.
I was taken aback. I just could not believe the depth and beauty that dwelt below Cassandra's surface. She had thoughts that filled me with questions and wonder. I ruminated on her words, thankful that I was laying on the grass next to such a wonderful person. I tried to speak, but nothing relevant came to mind, so instead I lost myself in the glowing night sky. We just laid there enjoying each other's silent company for a span that felt like 3 lifetimes in 13 days. Part 5. Just an artful idea and 9 sandwiches. I looked over to Cassandra so that I could explore the contours of her body, and I noticed that she too had been lost in the stars. Her face was scrunched up in the cutest way as she thought. Slowly she turned her head to meet my eyes. Then she quickly sat up. She stood up with a sense of worry that coursed through her body. She began removing golden autumn leaves from her hair before asking me to join her.
Stand up, Jared. This is important.
She said this in a way that made me unsure if she was being sarcastic or if she was just trying not to take herself seriously. I had an odd feeling in my stomach because I knew what she had to say would impact me for the remainder of my numbered days on Earth. I stood up thinking I would believe anything she had to say because I felt such a passion by being around her. But I knew the significance of the moment, so I slapped the lovesick puppy look off my face. Metaphorically speaking, of course. I listened intently to the silence that emanated from her thoughts. Cassandra applied a generous layer of chapstick to her lips before releasing her ideas into the night that was my consciousness.
Okay, Jared, don't laugh, but be brutal and honest if you hate this idea.
I kind of nodded. I did not want her to feel more self-conscious than she already did. Sandra was exposing her most intimate ideas to me, hoping that I would accept her in her purest state.
I have an art idea I've been working on for a while, but I haven't figured out all the details yet, nor have I shared my idea with any other person. What is art, Jared?
She asked me as the gravity of her thought rotated the stars around her long and stagnant shadows. Foolishly, I answered, "Art is anything." But she did not want an answer. She just wanted me to listen. She did not even acknowledge my reply before continuing.
Art has always been a part of humanity, Jared, as far as archaeologists can tell. And it has taken many forms, and it only keeps on changing. These days, money and art are bound together like links in the heavy metal of a chain, and I have no problem sharing my art with others or exchanging it for money. So here's my idea, Jared. I feel that although artists challenge society through their art, they don't challenge the monetary exchange that occurs at the end of the day for their work. I want my art to not only express my deepest thoughts, desires, and feelings, but I also want it to have a societal impact and a higher meaning.
"I do not understand," I said to her, with a true desire to comprehend her artful ideas.
I guess I'm not helping you understand. All right, I'll just give you the bare bones. It's just that this concept has taken so much of my time to create, so much effort and so much research. There's so many different angles to it that trying to explain it to you is so hard. I also want you to see it as a beautiful idea. For some reason.
She began blushing and looked away for a moment, after realizing that she had admitted that she cared about what I thought of her and her ideas. She began again.
An abstract of my idea is that I want to create art, then I want to sell it so that I can help others with the money. I don't want the money I make from art to be used for my survival or to accommodate my lifestyle. The art we see displayed in galleries is most often the end of our interaction with the artist. If the art is for sale and we buy a piece, we'll get to enjoy it for as long as we own it. The art is ours. Our money's with the artist. The end. But I want that to be the beginning of my story. So with me, not only would you get the art I create, but you'd also get to see what the money I was given is doing for others afterwards. The money then becomes the medium as my means of expression.
"How does that work exactly?" I asked with an air of confusion. "I mean, how would anyone know you were doing the things you claim you were doing with the money? Could people not think it was just a marketing scam?" I asked this feeling rather special, that I was the first person that was having this discussion with her. Cassandra seemed unaffected by my question, although she did pause while she carefully phrased her response.
Jared, have you heard of this thing called the internet? It's like this network of computers and databases where people can exchange information, pictures, videos, and even audio.
We both started laughing.
I would simply make a website that would document everything I did with the money. So, what do you think?
I love it. I think you could do a lot with this idea. How did it come to you?
Well, it wasn't something that came to me in a dream or anything like most of my ideas. It actually came from a lot of thought and from my experiences as an artist. I used to give most of my art away to friends and strangers just to make them smile. I decided when I was 18 that I would make art for the rest of my life because the feeling was amazing.
Sandra then began telling me of an experience that had influenced the early days of her idea.
I was living in Paris at the time, and I had made a small drawing with a black Bic pen. I decided that I would give it to an old feller that was sitting on a lonely red bench. This man was feeding a crew of pigeons, so I walked over to the man and sat down beside him. I was hoping to have a conversation that would end with me giving him the drawing. When I sat down, he looked at me. Then he slowly turned his gaze back to the birds. After a few minutes, he dug into his plastic bag of seeds, and with a shaky grip on the seeds, he gestured to me with a handful of bird feed. I cupped my hands to receive the seeds, and I began feeding the birds. Eventually, he noticed the drawing that sat between us, and he began asking questions regarding my style. And I told him all about my technique. I casually mentioned to him that the drawing was for him, and the man began to tell me how wonderful my drawing was. He went into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn brown leather wallet and said he wanted to give me something in return. I told him I didn't want his money. I just wanted the drawing to make him smile. We then got into an argument because he refused to accept my drawing unless I took his money. I remember how furious I felt. I just kept telling him that I didn't want his money, and I kept repeating that the sole purpose of the drawing was to bring someone joy. Money had nothing to do with it. But in reality, the drawing became nothing but a source of frustration for the giver and the receiver. The old man looked at me with a tragic smile and said that it would make him happy if I accepted the money. We went back and forth with each other about how neither of us cared about the money. I would say something like, "I really don't need the money." Then he'd say something like, "Well, I truly don't need the money." I eventually became so upset that I accepted the money and I walked away angry. As I watched my sad feet move across the sidewalk, I felt strange and filthy. As I continued walking along the musty streets of Paris, I noticed a panhandler. His face told a tragic tale. If I had to guess, I'd say he was probably in his late 30s. I unfolded the 2 crisp $100 bills that I had placed in the breast pocket of my coat. I began telling my story to the panhandler. I finished by telling him that since I didn't need the money, I would love nothing more than for the money to benefit another person. Now here's the oddest part, Jared. The man refused to take the money. The panhandler looked into my soul and told me that the money belonged to me. He said that although he had not seen my art, he was certain that not only it was beautiful, but that it was probably worth a lot more. There I was, on the streets of Paris, arguing with the panhandler, trying to convince him to take my money. I felt like a crazy person. It felt like everything I knew about reality was slipping through my fingers. Like my knowledge had become ungraspable, like the hot white sand on the beaches of Goa. I felt like this money was a punishment, like I had fallen out of favor with one of the many gods I had encountered on my travels. I walked away from the panhandler with an even greater sense of filthiness that I knew would never wash away in any of the holy rivers. I sat down on the cold pavement and I began to draw a picture. And I drew in an attempt to process the meaning of the money and why my art had attracted such a disturbing experience. As I was drawing, life was relentlessly trying to teach me about the connection between money and artistic expression. I drew and I thought, and some person walked past me and dropped some coins on my lap. Before I could even react, another smiling stranger walked by and gently placed a $5 bill on my bag. I instantly lost my temper. I crumpled the bill and ran after the smiling stranger. When I finally caught up to him, I grabbed him by the arm. I took him by surprise, and he turned sharply towards me. "Does it look like I need the money?" I yelled. The stranger didn't know how to react. His face reflected his complete lack of thoughts and action. The stranger was too frightened to free his arm from my grip. He somehow managed to calm me down with his astonished stare, long enough to ask me what my problem was. But what was my problem? What was I feeling? I had to admit that I had no idea what was happening to me. I told him that he was not responsible for my reaction. I told him that he was only an innocent mirror, reflecting back my rudeness on his reflective surface. A surface polished with kind actions. Jared, this world is full of dreamers and their reflections.
"What do you mean?" I asked.
"Never mind,"
she said, before continuing.
The man and I talked for a short while, but he ended our conversation because he was in a hurry and had to meet a close friend he had not seen in years. I hardly remember what we said to each other, but I can still vividly recall the smell of a small bottle of frankincense he carried in his pocket as a gift for his friend. At that moment, I was an independent and wealthy young lady with an extra $209.11. I looked around at my immediate surroundings. I heard the sounds of cars and motorcycles performing a crude dance with each other, and only with their final goal of reaching their destinations a few seconds faster than their neighbor. I took a deep breath of oxygen and vehicle exhaust. Then another. I watched the absurd ballet that motorized vehicles were executing on the roadways to the roaring music orchestrated by their engines. I looked at all the people coming or going or coming. I looked at all the shops, and I began thinking that the streets that surrounded me consisted only of shops and street markets. It dawned on me that everyone was either buying or selling, either coming or going. Even the panhandlers were selling feelings and ideas. Everyone was part of something I still don't understand and have yet to find an adequate word for in any of the 6 languages I speak. I took another breath, and I made a choice. I wanted to be part of it. I wanted to be buying more than my survival. I wanted to participate, to sell my beliefs and concepts on the marketplace that is this planet we inhabit. It was the first time since the death of my father that I felt I belonged. Like a tiny seed belongs to its black, fertile soil as it sprouts into being. I took my dirty money that had been clenched in my sweaty palms. I walked into a deli and purchased 9 fully loaded sandwiches and 9 small baskets of fruit. The deli clerk smiled and made a joke about my small stature and my enormous appetite. I couldn't stop laughing. I felt so happy. When I exchanged my art for sandwiches and fruit baskets, I felt alive. When I tipped the clerk for contributing to my consciousness, the clerk brought my kindness into question. He refused to accept the tip, saying it was too much money. I looked him in his eyes, and with a large smile, I told him that the tip was for him and that if he didn't want it, he should give it away. I gave him a slight wave and a wink before taking my goods and walking outside to the rest of my life. The sandwiches and fruit came with me to the next shop I entered as I walked into a new experience. The shop I was in consisted of many handmade articles of clothing. I chose the brightest colored scarves I could find, and I purchased 9 of them. The tags claimed that the scarves were made locally with 100% pure wool. The least relevant piece of information on the tags were the price. The scarves were not cheap, and in all my excitement, I left behind my math skills. I walked up to the dressed young lady behind the cash register with my smile, my 9 sandwiches, and my 9 fruit baskets. As she processed my purchase, I quickly realized that I was short $47.22. Without thinking, I went into my wallet and paid with my own money. Now, outside the shop, I had no choice but to take a deep breath of oxygen, mixed with car exhaust and the slight aroma of sandwiches. I looked at the streets around me, and Jared, as I retell this story, it's like I'm reliving it.
We both looked up at the stars and took in ample fresh air. Cassandra went into her pocket and retrieved her chapstick and applied a healthy dose to her lips. We just stood next to each other, looking into each other's eyes. I noticed that she was almost panting. She was filled with such excitement. "Why 9 sandwiches?" I asked, my words coming out far more serious than I had intended. Cassandra laughed and told me that there were 9 panhandlers on that street. Cassandra gave them each a sandwich and a fruit basket and a colorful scarf. She licked her shiny lips and said,
"What else could matter more than helping others if you can?"
Still don't know why, but I kissed her quickly on the cheek. I felt that it was the only way I could express what I was feeling at the time. She smiled and grabbed my hand and told me she had something to show me. I did not want to ask, but I felt I needed to interact with her to keep my energy high, doing all I could to keep the situation from turning awkward. 6. Inner conflict, money, and the search for a beautiful sanctuary. So where are we going? I asked.
Be patient, Jared.
She said, and nodded knowingly. Sandra then told me more about her art idea. She told me about the many Saturday nights spent alone reading thick art history books in search of other artists that may have lived similar ideas. Sandra did this hoping that she could draw from their experiences. She had no luck in finding any other artists in the past that had pursued a similar idea. She took this as a challenge and decided to pursue this endeavor on her own. As I thought about the careless, gifted artists I knew as acquaintances and the ones I had befriended, I began to imagine what all of them could do if their art fueled their social consciousness. I thought about how broke some of the less successful ones were, and how when they did sell their art, how meaningful it was for them to be able to have their necessities met. I've never shied away from saying what needs to be said in any situation. Tonight was no different. I can see why your idea would work for you, but it could never be a movement, because it has a flaw that could not be overcome. You are independently wealthy, thus you do not need to make money from your art.
I know, and that's one of the reasons I was a little afraid to share this thought with others. I think about this a lot, Jared. I mean, how can people overcome the need to make money from their art so their creations may be set free to do as they please in the world to beautify it?
She said, as her eyes portrayed her inner conflict with her idea. I smiled at her, made her eyes light up. I then said, it is still a powerful thought, and the details will be figured out. Just keep thinking and discussing your idea. I know you will do amazing things with it. She smiled wide, with a look that expressed that she already knew that. She did not need anyone to validate it for her. Sandra said, the look that almost made me forget who I was. As we walked past the house in our neighborhood that had an astonishing rose garden in the front yard, I stopped. I began reciting a poem I had written last year about the very same garden in the springtime. I could tell that she liked the poem because she was looking at me like I was looking at her. Our eyes were fixed on the others as we struggled to break free from the magnetic force that drew our bodies closer, the very force that holds all particles in the universe together. We were not scientists with large amounts of energy at our disposal, so we had no chance of breaking free from this powerful cosmic force. We were brought back to our bodies by the sound of a large dog's bark. As the dog barked and howled loudly, came out of our hypnosis.
Jared, you know you're very distracting, right?
She said with a raised eyebrow. I've been told this many times throughout my life. I think distracting others might be my soulful purpose on this earth. What do you mean? I asked with a sense of coyness.
Well, I wasn't outside swinging on a swing at 2 a.m. for no reason. I had a purpose.
She said this, scrunching her nose. Really? I just wasn't able to sleep. I go to the park all the time to swing at night when I cannot sleep. Cassandra smiled as she thought.
Jared, you do something to me.
She became somewhat nervous before continuing.
I was swinging on that swing tonight.
Swallowed.
To summon the courage to commit a profound crime.
Part 7. Criminals always have more fun. Okay, it must just be my fate. It seems that every time I stumble upon something that on the surface appears to be beautiful and amazing, the object quickly turns out to be made with many hidden, sharp, and jagged edges placed there to injure me when I pick the object up for closer examination. So here was this amazing girl that turns out to be a criminal, probably some jewel thief or murderer, perhaps a serial murderer, enchanting her victims with fables of art and beauty and humanitarianism. Then, doing the unthinkable. These were the thoughts in my mind. If you have not noticed, my imagination runs away with me often. At the same time, perhaps I was right. Then I really thought about it, and I did not care. I did not care what she had done in the past, or what horrendous things she would do in the future. Just the feeling of standing next to her, in front of a changing rose garden, was enough for me. In the worst case scenario, if she was a murderer, it was only death. All right, I said with a sigh. Let me have it. Murder? Is it murder?
Jared, because you're rather beautiful, I feel I must be truthful with you. I've never told a victim in advance about their pending fate.
Said this as her eyes turned cold, and she burst out with laughter.
Murder?
After my initial fear left with the cool late-night breeze, I could not help but laugh as well. When we finally settled down, I asked her about what unlawful activities she had in mind.
Jared, I know that you live on the moon, where there's no radio, no internet, or television to inform you about pressing current events. But most people, like myself, check in on reality, if only now and then.
Sandra said this with a smile. She licked her lips before continuing. I was smitten, smiled, and listened intently about how she would be breaking the laws that govern the land. Sandra went on to tell me about the political forces that were attempting to skew our idea of freedom so that it could fit their view of corporate freedom, the corporate freedom they believe can only be gained by enslaving others. Cassandra had no need to work any job, but she deemed it unjust to take even more time away from the collective.
This is where my art will change the world.
Said, full of confidence.
My immediate world.
Said, correcting herself. Cassandra told me about elaborate stencils she had made as social commentary, stencils depicting Dracula overseeing the draining of minimum wage workers as they climbed a broken ladder right into his trap. The stencil, the ladder was labeled the Ladder of Success. The workers in the stencil were wearing recognizable uniforms from institutions such as Walmart, McDonald's, Starbucks. She told me about another stencil where all the leaders of the political parties were operating a Rube Goldberg-looking machine that was fed with workers. At the end of the machine, dollar signs, peacocks, and luxury vehicles were being produced. She had also made a third stencil where Satan was portrayed as a prison guard. The prisoners were employees wearing recognizable logos. I looked at her for a fraction of a second. After she had told me her plan, I grabbed her hand and insisted we needed some supplies from my flat. I was so impressed with her ideas, her willingness to break the law for her idea of justice. She told me that if nothing else, her art would let others know they were not alone in their frustration. Cassandra believed that other people would express their anger if they knew that they were not alone. As we walked, I decided that stanzas of the poem I had written earlier would accompany her stencil. Part 8. With our arms linked, we headed to my flat.
What kind of supplies are we getting from your place?
Cassandra finally asked as we approached the front steps of my apartment building. The best kind, I said, hoping that she liked drinking cheap red wine. Before I unlocked the door, I told her about how my poem grappled with the societal problems that persisted in our reality. I proposed my idea to her about writing stanzas from my poem alongside her art. I waited while she thought. I was incredibly nervous, thinking that she would not approve. I opened the door wide as she nodded her head with enthusiasm, exclaiming it was a great idea. We floated up the 2 flights of stairs, and I reached my flat. The numbers 211 on the door stared into her soul. I took a deep breath as I revealed all I was by allowing Cassandra into my space. She looked around in darkness while I reached for the light switch. I accidentally flicked on the wrong switch, and all my plant lights went on. I could tell she was surprised by all the plants I kept in my home. I think I had roughly 56 different species of plants scattered throughout my flat, and a UV light above each one connected to the switch I had just turned on.
Wow, they're beautiful.
Cassandra said, lost in her amazement. Oh, yeah, they're all right, I said, distracted looking through the cupboard for a bottle of wine. I finally found one near the back behind about 11 empty bottles. Cheap wine, anyone? I said, struggling to pull out the cork. I never have good luck opening wine bottles. She watched me struggle for a moment before gently taking the bottle from me. Our hands touched for a moment as the bottle passed from my hands to hers. She took a large swig straight from the bottle, then passed it back so I could do the same. While I washed a water bottle so I could fill it with wine, Cassandra walked around my flat, exploring it with the curiosity of a 3-year-old with fresh eyes in the world. She examined my messy room and looked at the near-ancient books that filled my shelves. We do not have time, Cassandra. You can appraise my value based on the conditions of my flat tomorrow, but tonight we have some crimes to commit. I said this as I handed her my 4-page poem that had been sitting on my kitchen table. She started studying it and began to nod. We do not have time. You can read it on the walls, I said, pulling her hand towards the door. She agreed and we left my flat. We were so excited that I forgot to lock my door. And looking back on it, if I had returned from a night out with Cassandra and all my belongings were missing, I would not have cared. Honestly, not even a little. I forgot to grab a black marker, I said, disappointed in myself, as my body begged to turn back towards my flat.
Oh, don't worry, Jared.
Cassandra said knowingly.
I have everything we'll need at my place.
That, my blessed readers, was an understatement. Cassandra lived in the upper level of what is deemed a character house. Her walls were cotton candy pink, not the bright cotton candy pink color, but the pale cotton candy pink color that is produced when the carnival worker skimps on the cotton candy sugar to maximize the profits. Pink walls, I said.
Pink walls,
She repeated. The floors of her house were concealed by gray tarps, covered in millions of multicolored specks of paint. Bright art pieces were tastefully hanging on almost every wall. I had never seen such a fine collection of art. Did you paint all of these? I asked, lost in the beautiful expressions that surrounded me.
Some of them.
She said nonchalantly.
The others I've collected on my travels.
I could have spent months carefully following every stroke with my eyes in each of the well-composed paintings on the walls. This time, it was Cassandra reminding me of her purpose. She led me to her messy room and handed me her large stencils, which were neatly rolled up and bound with red twine. I could not help noticing that on her unmade bed lay a set of wrinkled, starry night sheets. What's with the sheets? I asked. Her response was simple and concise.
Oh, I got them in the gift shop at the Van Gogh Museum.
That is one of my favorite paintings, I said, impressed by her experience.
Mine too.
She said. Then she turned off the lights and hurried me out of her room. She led me to what I thought was an ordinary closet in the hall. I was proven wrong the second the door opened, and she switched on the closet light. Inside was a walk-in closet filled with every art medium imaginable. Every object was categorized and labeled, and each category was organized according to the rainbow color spectrum. followed by shades of white, then shades of black. Cassandra pointed to the hundreds of markers in all colors and sizes and invited me to pick out a few. I did this without hesitation. It took me about 2 seconds to make up my mind. I grabbed a handful of black Magnum 44 markers. Her decision took a little longer, as she carefully decided which cans of spray paint would be stuffed into her large black skateboarder's backpack. She fit about 22 different cans of paint into the pack that I offered to carry. Then she chose one more can, which she placed into the pocket of her hooded sweatshirt. I feel compelled to mention that here we call hooded sweatshirts bunny hugs, and that night I knew why.
Come on, Jared,
she said as she turned the lights off. I pulled out the water bottle filled with wine from the pocket of my bunny hug sweatshirt, and I took a large swig. I handed her the bottle. She did the same. She held the bottle to her chest after her drink. We just stared into each other's eyes, smiling like mental patients that had recently been lobotomized in the interest of public safety. As we left her apartment, we both looked up at the sky, as though we were children running outside for recess after a boring morning spent indoors. The outside world was a lucid dream, and Cassandra and I were its creators. I will never forget how nervous I felt. Every time my stomach would quiver, my legs responded by shaking. I kept numbing my nervous feeling with her wine. I had concluded that we would start by stenciling some hidden alleyways to work up the courage for some more public pieces. However, Cassandra had something else on her mind. I walked beside her as she led us towards the downtown district. She stopped at the most prominent bank in town. She turned to me with a look that said, "Here is our destiny." I was experiencing so many feelings in my stomach, and they were all racing to get to my chest. My nervousness was pulling ahead of the pack. Cassandra stepped in front of me and began to inspect the prospective site. I watched her examine the wall, so lost in the process. My nervousness began to slow, and my fondness of her outran all other emotions, crossing the finish line to my chest. I smiled. I straightened up my hooded sweatshirt, and I walked towards Cassandra. I stood beside her and began thinking about my poem and its position on the wall. She unrolled the first stencil, handing me its top right-hand corner. She held the left. As we held the stencil to the wall, she instructed me with her a little more to the left, and her up a little bit, and her down a slight tad. This went on until she found a comfortable spot for the stencil to settle. Cassandra handed me a roll of duct tape for me to adhere my corner to the wall, so she could begin her process. I put a strip of tape on my side of the stencil. I made eye contact with Cassandra as my teeth separated another strip from the roll. She smiled so warmly at me that I felt her gaze through my entire body. When my stare broke away from her eyes, I noticed that I had dropped the roll of tape. I pressed a strip of duct tape on the center of the stencil. I bent down to retrieve the roll. As I stood up, I looked at Cassandra. Her eyes were fixed on me. I pulled a strip of tape forward and brought it to her mouth so she could tear the strip with her teeth. I put my left hand over hers, and together we held up the stencil. With my right hand, I pressed down the strip of tape. I turned and put my arms around Cassandra's waist. The feelings in my chest were overwhelming and powerful. I could no longer resist the forces of nature. My body began to gravitate forward, and I was met halfway by Cassandra's lips. We kissed with a fierce passion that seemed only attainable in the poems of Rumi. But there we were in modern times, experiencing the oneness and love of the universe, as described by the words of the 12th century mystic. We had forgotten that we had a purpose in the world around us. Our main concern at the time was maneuvering our tongues in each other's mouths. If it were not for some cheeky onlooker honking the horn of his 1988 Toyota minibus, he yelled, "Get a room, you creep," as he drove past us. We pulled away from each other, realizing the general public would soon be making their way to the downtown district. We estimated that we had at least 1 hour and 1/2 before the downtown traffic began to appear. Cassandra started choosing her colors, and I started skimming my poem for the appropriate stanza to write on the wall. We both retreated to our world and began the process of artistic expression. My process ended first, and I stepped back to watch Cassandra work. She moved like liquid fire over the surface of water. Her movements were fluid and hypnotic. I focused on her face as she struggled to choose the right color of spray paint. I began to feel dizzy from the smell of aerosol, so I pulled out the water bottle of wine. I took a large swig to remedy the spin. I will never forget how much I appreciated that moment. There I was, in the most magical state of mind, breaking the law while feeling so much love. She set her spray can down on the ground and slowly untaped the stencil from the wall. She carefully put the stencil down. Cassandra walked over to where I was standing. I automatically put my arm around her waist, and together we stared at her work. It felt like we were first-time parents watching our 3-month-old child slumber after a long day of caring for her needs. It was a thing of beauty that we stared at with reverence and amazement, for we were the ones responsible for bringing this creation into the world. A loud truck drove by, which made us instantly look over our shoulders. We realized that the general public would soon be arriving at the site. We wasted no time. We packed up and moved to the next location, City Hall. We set up the next stencil and began expressing our feelings. This time we took turns keeping watch. We were forced to put down our weapons and walk around the corner a few times so our actions could be concealed. We finished with impressive speed and moved on to the next. The third mission felt a little different, and we found our anxiety increasing. We remedied our fears with wine from our water bottle. More people kept driving past, and there were a few pedestrians that inflamed our paranoia. We ignored our fears and pressed forward with our work. "Hold it right there," we heard echoing in the distance, as I felt a gloved hand grip my shoulder tightly. I dropped my Magnum 44 marker and slowly turned my body. I did not have the courage to look my accuser in the eyes. I began a scan that started at his shiny boots and stopped at the polished badge pinned to his chest. A police officer now stood in front of us. He had one hand on my shoulder and the other on the pistol strapped to his belt. We had known that we could potentially be jailed for our expression, but we did not revel in this detail, because we truly believed we were invincible. His deep voice spoke again. "What do you two think you're doing?" It was clear what we were doing. He just wanted us to admit our guilt out loud to the world. Perhaps it was the wine or the high level of emotion we were experiencing. Or maybe it was our pride in our work that broke us down, but nonetheless, we felt that we had to confess everything to set our souls free. Cassandra and I took turns speaking. We told the officer everything, beginning with my trip and cut lip, to us being the last two survivors of the apocalypse, to an unabridged version of our life stories, to our love for each other, and our anger at the politicians and business types that were conspiring to take away our freedom. We spoke of the mural at the bank and the one at City Hall. There we were, literally caught red-handed at the third mural, awaiting our fate. I am almost certain that the officer thought we were insane when we began our tale, but as we continued, he was far less sure. When we finished, he no longer had his hand on his loaded pistol. His posture was relaxed. The officer tipped his hat towards the back of his head, exposing his forehead to us. He did not speak, he just thought. Cassandra looked at me. I smiled and reached out to hold her hand. I felt joy knowing that no matter what transpired, we were going down together. Of all the things the officer could have said, we never expected the words that came from his mouth. "You know," he paused, "the kids are right. I have a family myself, and have no desire to work an extra 15 hours a week. He told us about his children and how he did not want them to grow up in a city that would, as he put it, turn them into robotic slaves. The officer then told us about his life, his marriage, and why he had become a police officer. When he was 22 years old, he was fresh out of university, his mind was filled with new ideas, and he wanted to make a difference in the community. So in his mind, it was a logical choice to join the force. He had romanticized being an officer of the land. He had pictured walking the beat as helping old ladies, talking to young kids to keep them out of trouble, and whatever else cops did on 1950s television programs. After a few years on the force, he began realizing that the world of policing was far more complex and much darker than he ever imagined. The officer began describing in great detail atrocious acts that he and his fellow officers committed, crimes that many others were imprisoned for. Once inside the system, the officers quickly adapted to manipulating their power for the benefit of themselves and the highest bidders. We were this man's Catholic priest listening to his confession, judging by his desperation to express these secrets. Not only had he been living with his sin for a long time, but it appeared that this was the first time he had shared a word of them to anyone. We kept glancing at one another, exchanging looks of confusion that went unnoticed by the officer as he talked. It was as though he could not see us because we were separated with a divider that conceals the priest from the public in the confession booth we found ourselves in. We became the water that could rinse the blood from the officer's stained hands. It was hard for us to understand the inner systems of life at such a young age. We had no desire to run, although I would like to note that we had ample opportunity to expedite a getaway. The officer had almost forgotten our existence and our crimes as he released the weight from his heart and soul to the material world. We listened intently, this broken man attempting to make himself whole. He made us aware that he was tired of hiding behind a badge that had lost all meaning to him and to the people around him. Of all the outcomes our artistic mischief could have produced, this was the most surprising. There we were, standing on the wrong side of the scales of justice, awaiting judgment by a broken man, nearly in tears, overwhelmed by his remorse. Time this badge did something real, the officer said, almost yelling in our faces. We exchanged looks with raised eyebrows and curiosity at the prospect of the officer's statement. I've done very few things to help anyone since I took the oath and buttoned up this uniform. Today is different. You kids, he paused to swallow. You kids, there's just something pure about your love and your intentions, and I agree with your courage and desire to help change a situation that is clearly unjust. I only wish and dream that I was capable of such strength to stop, but I'm not. I will, however, allow the two of you the freedom to continue to make art, love, and change, the officer said with complete sincerity. I believe in very few things if there is no evidence of any kind to support an idea. But I honestly believe that Cassandra had allowed me to step into a new realm of reality where love and desire made anything one pursued possible. The officer told us that he would look the other way, and if somehow the whole city was covered in these stencils, he might just forget that he ever ran into the couple of culprits. This information was incredible, but the officer went even further. He drew a small flip book from his shirt pocket, and he wrote on it his badge number, vehicle number, and dispatch ID code. He told us as he handed me the paper that if any copper stopped us, to give the copper the information and to tell him that Johnny Law was on our side. The officer's name was Jonathan. If I do anything right with my wretched life, it'll be to protect the two of you from anyone's attempt to silence your beautiful expression. He took off his hat and put it half sideways on my head, saying, "It looks better on you," before walking away. Part 9. Freedom is almost always free. I have concluded that very few people experience true freedom, although I believe the feeling is available to every human being. As Cassandra and I walked down the empty street with her black hooded sweatshirt and her arms linked, with a heavy black backpack filled with spray cans slung over my shoulder, and a sideways cop hat that now kept Cassandra's head warm and stylish. We were free. We drank publicly from our wine water bottle as we pleased. It was hard keeping in mind that there were things wrong with the world that surrounded us, when I felt such joy in every cell that composed my body. I was very aware that this feeling may wear off, but the politician's desire for power and money would not. This was the thought that kept me from kissing Cassandra again and again and being lost in her tender touch. By the time we finished our sixth piece, our buzz was wearing off, and we began to feel the effects of being tired human beings in desperate need of sleep. As we were feeling too tired together, we both spotted a bench at exactly the same time. We collectively decided to sit upon its red wooden surface. I felt as though we had a deep conversation with each other, but I know we did not speak a single word. We did not have the need to hold hands. We shared the deepest satisfaction, just sitting beside each other, enjoying the come down from our ecstatic experience. We did eventually talk, and we came to the decision that we had the strength for one more mural. Cassandra assured me that she knew the perfect spot, and with that, we dragged her feet to what would be our last manifestation. Each took a turn sucking at the mouth of her now empty water bottle, in hope a drop of wine would settle our thirst. Cassandra said we only had to climb over one fence to get to our destination. My spirits sank below my feet. She gave me a tired glance and urged me on by saying,
"Come on, it'll be fun."
But I was not sure. I ended up climbing the fence with the paint tack on my back because I had a feeling something was guiding us there. Ever since that day, I have never questioned the existence of such guiding feelings, and I listen to them as often as is practicable. We arrived at the local skate park that had historical significance. For over 2 decades, young skateboarders have been coming here not just to skateboard, but to build and create art. Our skate park is one of a few that was not funded by the government. Every inch of concrete here has been laid by the skaters themselves. A great deal of the concrete was most likely stolen in its powdered form from construction sites all over town. The city councils have tried shutting it down numerous times, but they have been unsuccessful, because the former owner of the vacant lot donated the land to the skaters once he saw what they had done with it. He did this shortly before giving up his entire real estate empire to a handful of charities. The legend states that he went to the high mountains of Tibet to become a monk. The deed to the property has been passed down for 2 generations. We were ready to express our souls to our peers, the future of our here city. Adjacent to the skate park is a large wall the city built for noise reduction, but most skaters believe true function is for self-expression. At any given time, one should expect to see a young person or two creating art on the wall surface. But it was never like this.
I know I'm tired, but whatever you put in this wine is making me hallucinate.
Cassandra said. I don't think she was joking, but I started laughing uncontrollably because I, too, could not believe what I was seeing. Part 10. The Price of Freedom. There she was, her long silver hair reaching the small of her back. It was bound together with a red hair scrunchie. She was slim and agile with her tool. She looked elegant in a crazy-looking sweater. I was convinced she bought the sweater on eBay with the claim it was a sweater Bill Cosby wore during the taping of one of his episodes. She was also sporting a pair of black combat boots that stopped a few inches above her ankles. How could this be real? I kept whispering. I began to test my reality as advised by leading dream experts in order to awaken to the potential of the dream. All the tests failed. It was now clear that this was reality, and although I was in a state of fatigue, I accepted the truth. The truth that what we were seeing was actually happening. We walked towards her slowly, out of curiosity, hoping to keep her presence unknown. As though she was an exotic bird we did not want to scare away without first snapping a great picture. The woman sensed her presence and began to work slower. We foolishly thought she had not noticed us and took her slowing pace as a sign to get a little closer. When we were about 50 feet from her, she whipped around to face us without dropping her brush or spilling the paint on her palette. She confronted us with a large can of bear mace. "What do you want?" she snapped. She lowered her weapon when she noticed we were not uniformed officers on the verge of infringing on her freedom. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm a bit tense. I've never done anything like this. This is the only thing I could come up with to keep myself from being caught." It was funny that the 56-year-old woman that stood before us was committing exactly the same crime for the very same reason in the very spot we had chosen. Her art seemed far more elaborate, for it was created with oil paint and a brush. The painting she was working on was of an old lady with a walker chained to a giant block of limestone. The old lady in the painting was pulling the block towards the pyramid being constructed. In close proximity was a guard wearing a recognizable Egyptian headdress. The guard in the painting was also wearing what appeared to be a businessman uniform. You know, black tie, white shirt, and a black Italian suit. We thought it was brilliant. On top of the whole scene was a website written in beautiful printing. We knew time was essential, but we still had to tell the lady our story. Of course, it was a much shorter version of the night's event. We omitted her love, our life stories, while we emphasized her civil disobedience, the stencils, and the poems. She looked at us with a sense of respect because of her age and her awareness of the world around us. We did not have time to exchange names. We just drove right into deep discussion, like military generals conspiring before a potential raid on the enemy. The lady told us that we were not alone. There were many artists in the streets that night and early that morning doing exactly what we had been doing. But there was a difference. This difference being that they were leaving a website on every mural to connect the general public with the core of the movement. She let us know that many people were organizing against the government and the businessmen responsible for the change in social policy. A group of IT specialists in the movement had created a website to distribute information. Its servers were undetectable, and the website was hosted in a country the lady could not pronounce the name of. She said that for security reasons, the name of the country was only known to a handful of people. Core leaders in the movement were able to publish essays and information on the website if they had the special password. This password was 47 characters long, and it was changed every 74 hours. He told us that the passwords are only valid for 74 hours because the programs needed to crack such a complex code would need roughly 83 hours to complete the task. He then touched upon the content of the website, along with general information about the movement. There was also the names, the addresses, the home phone numbers, cellular phone numbers, work addresses, driver's license numbers, social insurance numbers, financial statements, tax return statements, personal emails, any type of information a knowledgeable hacker could get their hands on about each politician and businessman behind the proposed legislation. We paused to swallow. Our lovesick puppy grins faded from our faces after she had divulged the content of the website. We knew the seriousness of the movement, and we could now understand why she was armed with bear mace, ready to attack a police officer so she could escape. The lady told us about the strikes that would commence in the coming days. The strikes would be initiated by the garbage men. The movement had plans to continue collecting the garbage. The trucks would then dump the trash on the driveways of every politician and businessman involved. Next would come what I thought was a brilliant act of civil disobedience. Employees everywhere were asked to join. Pictures of the politicians and businessmen would be distributed and posted everywhere. And people would simply not acknowledge these individuals. No one would serve them at coffee shops, grocery stores, restaurants, gas stations, etc. Anywhere they went, it would be as though they did not exist. The movement had cooked up many schemes, each one an exercise to prove the power belonged to the community, not to a small group of power-hungry people. Kids are young and in love, he continued, and I wouldn't hold anything against you if you decided not to risk your freedom for this cause. She began to list her concerns and the danger any organizer would be in if they were caught by the police. Cassandra took the police hat off her head and examined it. It quickly regained its original meaning. It scared her, and she threw it to the ground, recalling all the brutal footage she had seen of riot police clashing with unarmed members of the public. Serious stuff, she said softly. Might even be life or death, as there are many things when money and power are involved. She paused. Then, she continued, there's the risk that we don't succeed, and all our efforts are for nothing. She told us that it only took one person to sell out the group, and we would all be finished. She cited history and the many instances where movements ended when insiders sold out their friends and comrades to the highest bidders. Kids are young. Why not leave this place and start fresh somewhere new, somewhere less fascist, she said with a deep sense of wisdom. As for me, I have no choice. I was born here, and I'll die here. But what I will not do is give another second of my life to these men. I felt the weight of the war we had joined. See the many outcomes our potential futures had in store. Our fatigue gave way to her fears. Cassandra snuggled next to me so I might hold her, which I did. The lady could see the impact she had had on us, but she tried to relax the situation. I'm not saying you need to decide now. You both look tired and a little tipsy. Here, she said, as she handed us a handwritten card with the website and a 47-character long string of symbols, numbers, and letters. You have 65 hours left before the password expires. All I ask is for the two of you to really think about the impact your actions will have. She turned her back and continued working on her mural. We walked home in silence, no longer sure of who we were, desiring nothing more than a simple sleep filled with childhood dreams. Part 11, we concluded that it was not just a childhood dream. For the readers old enough to recall their movement 13 years ago, you know how the situation unfolded. For the readers unfamiliar with the hardship, talk to your parents, and they will tell you all of what transpired. The reason I decided to tell the story of the night Cassandra and I became aware of the movement is because Frank, the editor of the People's Post, has not gotten off my back for the last 5 years about putting the genesis of our story in his paper. Needless to say, Cassandra and I joined the movement the following day. I published my poem in its entirety on the website, and the rest is history. I never thought our actions that night would lead to me becoming the mayor of our city 6 years later. The movement was far from easy, and many good people lost so much so the collective could prosper. I would like everyone to reflect on the sacrifices they made so the movement would be successful. I do not want this story to be a simple historical account of how Cassandra and I met and about how we joined the movement. I want this story to inspire every young reader to act when they feel it necessary to oppose injustice in the world around them. There is no better feeling than being in love and using that love to fuel change. I do not know what else to say. I am very grateful that Frank gave me the opportunity to reminisce on one of the best nights of my life. The only advice I can offer to any beautiful reader is to keep on dreaming, because the line between the dream world and reality is a very, very thin one. I must get back to working hard for this lovely city. But one last thing before I do. I just want to thank the many people that played a part in making our collective dream a solid reality.